Every P-38 pilot in the Pacific was taught one rule: never turn with a zero. But what if that rule was killing them? The summer of 1943 baked the red earth of New Guinea into dust, and above that dust, the 5th Air Force was bleeding men and machines into the jungle sky. In just 6 weeks, 37 P-38 Lightnings had vanished, some spiraling into the sea, others swallowed by the green mountains that hid Japanese airfields like knives beneath the mist. Lieutenant Jack Hayes was 23 years old and already carried the look of a man twice his age. Each morning he climbed into a cockpit that felt more like a coffin, strapped himself in, and flew toward enemies he could barely see and never outturn. Down on the flight line, Sergeant Frank Miller watched him go, wiping oil from his hands onto coveralls already black with grease. Miller was 26, a mechanic from Long Beach, California, who could make a P-38 purr like a cat, but couldn't change the one thing that mattered most: its sluggish roll. He'd seen the wrecks come back on flatbed trucks, wings folded like broken arms, the smell of fuel and burnt rubber hanging in the heat. The reports always said the same thing: pilot error, improper maneuver, failure to follow doctrine. But Miller had been around machines all his life. He knew when a man had failed, and when the machine had. The P-38 Lightning was a marvel on paper. Twin engines, twin booms, power to spare, and the speed to outrun anything Japan could build. Yet in a dogfight, it was a lumbering beast, too slow to roll, too heavy to dance. The Japanese Zero, half its weight and built with the agility of a dragonfly, could swing through a full horizontal turn in under 8 seconds. The Lightning took almost twice that. In the sky, those extra seconds were an eternity, the difference between firing and falling. Hayes and the other pilots followed the manual to the letter. Dive fast, shoot, climb out, never turn. But battle doesn't read manuals. Once a Zero got inside your turning circle, the fight was over before you even felt the tracer fire. Miller saw the pattern forming, the rhythm of death that repeated every morning at dawn. Engines start, wheels lift, silence by noon. He began studying the planes that came back riddled with holes but still alive, running his fingers along the control cables that snaked through the twin tails, listening to the faint metallic hum they made when plucked. The P-38's ailerons were linked by steel cables nearly 20 feet long, routed through pulleys, brackets, and turns that gave them a bit of play. About 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. To an engineer, that was within tolerance. To a pilot twisting through combat at 200 miles an hour, it was half a heartbeat too slow. Miller imagined what that delay felt like inside the cockpit. You yank the stick left, the cable tightens, the slack disappears, and only then do the wings respond, just in time for a Zero to slip behind your tail. The problem wasn't courage or training. It was physics, baked into the airplane itself. Officially, nothing was wrong. The specs had been signed in Burbank, the manuals printed, the tolerances approved. And yet pilots were dying one by one for the sake of that tiny gap in a piece of wire. Miller tried not to think about it when he tightened bolts or checked hydraulic lines, but the thought kept creeping back. Maybe perfection on paper wasn't good enough in war. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the Owen Stanley Range, he'd look across the line of parked Lightnings gleaming in the orange light and wonder how many of them would still be standing there tomorrow. The air smelled of avgas, sweat, and resignation. Somewhere far away, the engineers who built these machines were solving equations. Here, in the mud of New Guinea, men were solving how to stay alive long enough to see another sunrise. Miller didn't know it yet, but the next time a P-38 left his hands, something inside it would change forever. When the manuals failed, one mechanic decided to break every rule in them. The next morning, the flight line smelled of hot oil and wet dust, the kind that clings to skin and never leaves. Another Lightning had gone down over the bay, and the news reached the maintenance crews before the wreckage did. The pilot was Lieutenant David Chen, a quiet kid from Sacramento who used to help Miller patch bullet holes between sorties. Chen had joked that his plane always came home with more holes than it left with. This time, it didn't come home at all. His wingman said he tried to roll out of a turn, but the aircraft hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for a Zero to rake the cockpit with cannon fire. Miller stared at the empty maintenance log with Chen's name still fresh on the top line. Next to the column marked Control Cable Inspection, his own initials stared back at him like a signature of guilt. He had checked everything, tightened every bolt, followed every rule, and yet the plane still lagged when it mattered most. That night, he went over to the hangar alone. The rows of lightnings slept under tarps, their silver skins glinting in the lantern light. He climbed up onto one wing, removed an access panel, and pulled at the aileron cable with his bare hand. It moved, ever so slightly, before tension caught. He measured it by eye, about 3/8 of an inch, within factory limits, within tolerance. The words felt poisonous now. Miller tugged again, harder this time, and listened. The sound that came back was a dull metallic twang, like a muted guitar string. It was the same sound he'd heard 100 times before, but now it carried something different. An echo of all the men who'd died because someone decided that close enough was good enough. He spent the next few days trying to make others hear it too. He brought his wrench chief over, plucked the wire, asked, "You hear that delay?" The chief shrugged. "That's how they're built. Burbank says it's fine." Even the engineering officer brushed him off. "You're chasing ghosts, Sergeant. The cable tension's within spec." But Miller couldn't let it go. He started timing the delay himself, marking down figures in a grease-stained notebook. At low speeds, the response lag was roughly 4/10 of a second, long enough for a Zero to roll inside the Lightning's turn and line up its guns. He wrote next to it, 4/10 equals death. On paper it was nothing, but in combat, that nothing was everything. At night, when the power generators hummed in the distance and the jungle droned with insects, he lay awake in the barracks thinking about that tiny space inside the cable run, how it separated survival from loss. The P-38's design had been genius in so many ways, but it had been engineered in a factory thousands of miles away by men who never had to watch one crash and burn. Here at the edge of the world, that design flaw had become a curse. Miller remembered Chen's last grin, the easy way he'd said, "If this old crate ever turns faster, I'll buy you a drink." That promise echoed in his head like a challenge he couldn't ignore. He began experimenting quietly, using scrap wire and spare pulleys from damaged aircraft. He studied the tension ratings stamped into the parts, the way different alloys flexed under stress. He even borrowed a small spring scale from the tool crib, testing how much extra pressure the cable could take before binding. Each result went into his notebook, a secret journal of numbers and hopes. One evening, he sat on an ammo crate near the hangar doors, listening to the tropical rain beat against the tin roof. The smell of fuel mixed with the scent of wet earth. He turned the problem over in his mind again and again. The manuals said adjusting cable tension beyond spec would void the warranty, risk metal fatigue, and potentially jam the ailerons. But the manuals hadn't been written by men flying under fire. They hadn't seen Zero tracers whip past their friends' canopies. He realized that the war wasn't being lost in dogfights. It was being lost in fractions of an inch. The tolerances were too tight for bureaucracy and too loose for survival. That was when the idea first flickered, fragile but unstoppable. Maybe the solution wasn't a new part at all. Maybe it was something small, something improvised, something that could live inside the system unnoticed, yet change everything. Outside, lightning cracked across the horizon, lighting up the hangar windows for a split second. casting shadows that looked like twisted strands of wire dancing in the air. Miller stared at them and made a decision. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to find a way to take that slack out of the system, no matter what it took. In the background, the rain grew louder, almost rhythmic, like the sound of a heartbeat counting down. And then, under the hum of the generators, he heard another sound, the faint metallic hum of a broken piano string someone had tossed aside days earlier. He picked it up, ran his thumb along its surface, and felt the strength hiding inside it. One night, under the whine of those same generators, Frank Miller reached for that broken piano string, and history's most forbidden repair began. The air inside the hangar was heavy with heat and the smell of fuel, a thick silence broken only by the buzz of insects drawn to the overhead lights. Outside, the jungle was sleeping, but inside, a man was quietly rewriting the limits of his world. Miller laid the string across his palm. It was 6 inches long, thin yet impossibly strong, the kind of wire that could hold tension far beyond its size. He bent it gently, testing its spring. Then he set to work. His hands were already raw from the day's labor, his coveralls smeared with oil and blood from a scraped knuckle. He opened the left access panel of Lieutenant Hayes's P-38, the same aircraft that had nearly been grounded for sluggish controls. The metal was still warm from the afternoon sun. Inside the narrow compartment, the control cable ran taut through a series of pulleys, each one polished by constant use. Miller could feel the slack, the small, invisible gap that haunted him. He took a pair of pliers and began shaping the piano wire into a crude Z. The steel resisted, pushing back against his efforts. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the floor panels, mixing with grease. He slipped once, the edge slicing into his thumb. The cut wasn't deep, but blood traced a red line down the wire, staining it like a mark of intent. He didn't stop. The entire process took less than 10 minutes, but each second stretched like an hour. The sound of his own breathing echoed against the aluminum skin of the plane. Every turn of the pliers carried risk. He was violating 12 separate regulations from the maintenance manual. No mechanic was authorized to alter flight control systems without engineering approval. If discovered, he could be stripped of rank or court-martialed. But the faces of the pilots he'd lost, Chen, Morrison, Parker, flashed in his mind. They had trusted the manual. The manual hadn't saved them. When the Z-shaped piece was finally ready, Miller worked it into the cable path between 2 anchor points, forcing the fit. The added tension sang through the wire with a high metallic note, sharp and pure. He plucked it once more, and this time there was no lag, no dead sound, only the clean resonance of metal under perfect load. It felt alive. He reattached the panel, wiped the blood away, and leaned back against the fuselage, heart pounding. For a long time, he just stood there, staring at the plane, half expecting it to betray him, to sag under its own weight, or snap the new wire in defiance. But the cable held, tight and responsive. In that moment, Miller knew he'd crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. By dawn, the hangar was alive again. Mechanics rolled fuel drums, crews loaded ammunition, and pilots gathered for briefing. Lieutenant Hayes approached, yawning, his face drawn with fatigue. "Morning, Frank," he said, tapping the Lightning's wing. "Think she'll hold together today?" Miller forced a grin. "Better than ever, Lieutenant." He watched Hayes climb into the cockpit, settle into the seat, and pull on his gloves. The engines coughed to life, twin propellers slicing the humid air. Miller stood on the flight line, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black. He told himself that the modification would work, that the plane would fly smoother, respond faster. But another thought crept in, darker and quieter. What if it failed? What if the wire snapped at altitude, locking the ailerons mid-turn? What if he'd just condemned a man to die for the sake of an idea? The noise of the engines drowned out the fear. The squadron began taxiing toward the runway, the ground trembling beneath their wheels. At 7:42 a.m., Hayes's Lightning took off, lifting into a sky painted gold by the rising sun. Miller shaded his eyes and followed its climb until it vanished into the glare. He stood there long after the sound had faded, feeling the silence press down around him. He had just placed his faith and his future in 6 inches of stolen wire. For the next hour, the base went about its routines, refueling trucks, sorting ammunition, checking weather reports. Miller stayed near the edge of the runway, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, far away, faint but unmistakable, came the stutter of distant engines and the faint crackle of radio chatter. The intercept group had made contact. Japanese fighters, 18 Zeros, had been spotted over the Huon Gulf, closing fast. Miller's stomach tightened. He listened to the static, straining for familiar voices. The minutes dragged. Sweat ran down his back. Then a voice broke through the interference, breathless, shouting coordinates, then laughter, short, disbelieving laughter. He didn't recognize it at first, but then the call sign came through. Lightning 3, 2 confirmed, 1 smoking, still in the fight. It was Hayes. Miller felt his knees weaken. He didn't dare celebrate, not yet. The fight was still on. He looked toward the sky where the sun was climbing, and for a moment he thought he saw something glint far above the clouds. A flash of silver banking hard, too fast, too smooth to be the sluggish lightning he had known. Somewhere up there, the laws of physics were being rewritten. He whispered to himself, "Hold together, Jack. Just hold together." And as the battle raged unseen beyond the horizon, Frank Miller stood on that field knowing that for better or worse, nothing about the P-38, or about him, would ever be the same again. The first word from the sky came 20 minutes later, a thin thread of radio static carrying fragments of voices, shouts, call signs, the clipped rhythm of men fighting for their lives. Then silence. The kind of silence that makes time stretch and the air feel heavier than gravity itself. The crew on the ground went still, each man frozen mid-task, listening to the airwaves as if willing sound back into them. In the control tower, the operator leaned close to his headset, lips moving silently. Then a burst of noise broke through. Lightning 3, tally 3, repeat, tally 3. The voice was Hayes's, raw with disbelief. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then it sank in. He'd just claimed 3 kills in 1 sortie. Impossible, they thought. The P-38 couldn't turn like that. Couldn't keep up with a Zero in a horizontal fight. But somewhere above the clouds, a pilot was proving otherwise. While the base held its breath, the battle unfolded over the Huon Gulf, where the sun cut sharp reflections on the sea like shards of glass. Hayes's flight of 4 Lightnings had been ambushed by a squadron of 18 Japanese fighters diving from 13,000 feet. The initial pass should have ended it, but when the lead Zero rolled into its attack, Hayes pulled hard left, expecting the usual sluggish response. And instead, the aircraft snapped into the turn with frightening precision. It was instant, alive, almost too eager. The inertia he'd fought for months was gone. The stick moved, and the wings obeyed as if connected to his thoughts. He fell inside the Zero's turning circle, lined up the gun sight, and squeezed the trigger. 5 streams of tracers reached across the sky, tearing into the enemy's fuselage. The explosion flared bright against the blue, a streak of fire tumbling toward the water. 1 down. Hayes barely had time to breathe before 2 more Zeros dropped in behind him. Instinct said, climb, but instinct also remembered what climbing too slow could cost. He rolled hard right, reversed direction, and felt the Lightning pivot almost violently, cutting inside the attacker's path. The sudden change of position left the Japanese pilots overbanked and vulnerable. Hayes pulled lead, fired again. The second Zero disintegrated in mid-turn. The third pilot tried to pull away, but Hayes stayed glued to him, matching every move, every twitch of the enemy's wings. The P-38 responded faster than thought itself. Another burst, another plume of smoke. 3 victories in under 17 minutes. For a man who had never scored a single kill, it was like waking in a different world. He called in his position, voice trembling between exhaustion and awe, then climbed back toward the coast to rejoin the formation. Behind him, the sea glittered with burning wrecks. Above him, the sky was empty. On the ground, Miller caught sight of the returning formation, tiny silver dots against the light. As the planes approached, he counted 4. All 4. None missing. The engines grew louder, the rhythm steady, confident. When Hayes's Lightning touched down, the wheels screeched, bounced, and settled. He taxied to a stop, canopy sliding open with a hiss. His flight suit was soaked with sweat, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unclip the harness. Miller ran toward him, unsure whether to speak. Hayes climbed down, took off his helmet, and for a moment just stared at the mechanic as though searching for the right words. Finally, he said too that Miller would never forget. It worked. The rest of the crew gathered, crowding around, trying to understand. Hayes told them how the plane felt. Faster, sharper, like the controls were wired straight into his nerves. It wasn't just smoother. It was something else entirely, as if the Lightning had been set free from its own weight. He described how the Zeros reacted, how their usual tricks failed, how their turns couldn't cut inside him anymore. The mechanics looked at each other, trying to reconcile what they'd heard with what they knew to be possible. No one asked Miller directly what he had done. Not yet. But as they dispersed, a few glances lingered. Curious, suspicious, maybe even respectful. That night, the airstrip glowed under a thin crescent moon. Hayes filed his combat report, the words still shaking on paper. 3 confirmed kills, 0 losses. The numbers spoke for themselves, but the explanation did not. When the squadron commander read it, he frowned. How the hell did he outturn a 0? He muttered. There was no answer in the manuals for that. Meanwhile, Miller sat outside the hangar, his hands still stained with oil, staring at the faint stars barely visible through the haze. He could hear the distant waves, the steady thrum of the generators, and beneath it all, the quiet echo of that plucked piano wire still ringing in his head. He didn't think of glory, or recognition, or even victory. He thought of the simple fact that for once no pilots had died that day. Somewhere in the jungle beyond, the enemy would be puzzling over what had changed, unaware that it was hidden in a sliver of steel no bigger than a finger. The next morning, as dawn painted the sky, Captain Frank Dalton watched Hayes's Lightning taxi past. He had seen the flight's radio logs, the impossible maneuvering, the kill confirmations. Something about that airplane was different. He walked over to the maintenance line and found Miller already at work, sleeves rolled up, tools laid out with surgical order. Dalton studied him for a moment before asking quietly, "What did you do to that plane?" Miller hesitated, then met his gaze. The answer hung unsaid between them, fragile and dangerous. Dalton didn't press further, not yet. He just nodded, a silent, understanding passing between soldiers who knew the cost of secrets. Hayes's triumph would spread through the base before noon, turning into whispers, then questions, then envy. The pilots wanted to know how one of their own made the Lightning dance with the grace of a 0. The answer, for now, remained buried inside a wing panel, sealed under rivets and grease. But whispers travel faster than sound in wartime, And soon, men from other squadrons would come looking for the mechanic from Long Beach, the one rumored to have made a miracle out of a broken string. What had started as one man's desperate act was about to become something larger, something unstoppable. And as the sun rose over the airfield, Frank Miller looked out across the rows of lightnings and knew that a storm was coming, one not of bullets or bombs, but of questions he could never truthfully answer. The rumor moved faster than mail, faster than orders, carried by voices in canteens and whispers between hangars. Pilots talked in low tones about a mechanic who had found a way to make a P-38 roll like a dream, who had somehow tightened the soul of the machine until it felt weightless. Some called it luck, others superstition, but the stories had a pulse that no one could ignore. Captain Frank Dalton was the first officer to ask outright. He came to Miller that afternoon, the smell of burnt rubber still in his flight suit, and said quietly, "Whatever you did to Hayes's Lightning, do it to mine." There was no threat in his voice, only the weary certainty of a man who'd buried too many friends. Miller hesitated, torn between fear of punishment and the sight of those empty bunks lined up in the barracks. He nodded. That night, under dim lamps, he repeated the same act that had haunted him ever since, the bending of a 6-inch wire, the quiet hum of tension finding balance. By dawn, Dalton's P-38 had been changed. The following morning, he took it up, tested it in maneuvers, and returned to base almost laughing. "Feels like she's reading my thoughts," he told his wingman. Word spread like wildfire. Within a week, half the flight line had heard of Miller's trick. Some believed it was a myth. Others swore they could feel the difference just from watching takeoffs. Mechanics from nearby squadrons came asking for details. Miller tried to downplay it, saying it was nothing more than a minor adjustment. But the truth was already out of his hands. Pilots began to trade notes in the mess hall, sketching diagrams on napkins, passing along what they'd heard. Cut the wire, bend it into a Z, tighten the cable until it sings. No paperwork, no approval, just 8 minutes of work that could change everything. At Goosap Airfield, a crew chief named James Watkins heard the rumor from a transfer pilot and decided to try it. His first modified Lightning returned from a mission with its pilot grinning ear to ear, claiming he'd finally managed to outroll a 0. The next day, 4 more aircraft were altered. By the end of the month, there were dozens. From Dobadura to Port Moresby, the modifications spread like an unspoken code, passed from one pair of oil-stained hands to another. Official inspections found nothing unusual. The mechanics learned to remove the wire tensioners before checkups and reinstall them afterward. They knew it was wrong, but they also knew it was saving lives. Meanwhile, something strange was happening across the front. Japanese pilots who had dominated the skies for years began to notice a shift they couldn't explain. Reports from the 11th Air Fleet spoke of American fighters turning with unprecedented agility. Veteran ace Saburo Sakai himself encountered one of the altered Lightnings. He went into his usual maneuver, confident the heavy twin-engine fighter could never follow. But as he rolled, the American plane matched him move for move, coming around faster than physics should have allowed. He barely escaped. In his debriefing, Sakai described it with one word: impossible. Within weeks, Japanese commanders ordered their pilots to avoid engaging P-38s unless they held a clear numerical advantage. For the first time in the Pacific, the 0 had lost its confidence. Back at the American bases, no one officially claimed credit. Commanders noticed the sudden improvement in kill ratios. Losses that had been 2-to-1 now leveled, then reversed. But they attributed it to better tactics, better morale, anything but an unapproved mechanical change. To the pilots, though, it was no mystery. They knew what had changed. When they climbed into their cockpits and felt the controls respond instantly, They thought of the man from Long Beach who had risked everything to tighten a cable no one else believed in. The mechanics whispered about him like a folk legend. He fixed the lag, they said. He made the lightning sing. Miller watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and dread. Every new success meant more attention, more risk. If the wrong officer asked the wrong question, the entire thing could collapse overnight. One evening, as he closed up the hangar, Captain Dalton found him sitting alone, staring at his grease-blackened hands. "You started something bigger than you know," Dalton said softly. "You realize that?" Miller didn't answer. He wasn't sure if it was a compliment or a warning. In truth, it was both. The Pacific skies were changing, and with them, the war itself. But Miller's name would never appear in any report, never reach the men who studied tactics in Washington. His act was invisible, hidden inside the steel bones of every lightning that took off from those dusty runways. Still, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what he'd done. The piano wire had held so far, but for how long? One failure, one snapped strand, and everything would come crashing down. Not just a plane, but the fragile trust that kept their secret alive. As the engines of another night patrol roared into the dark, Miller stood outside and listened to their sound fading into the distance. Each one carried his fingerprint, his risk, his faith. He whispered to himself, "Just bring them back." And in that quiet prayer lay both the triumph and the burden of every mechanic who had ever tried to outthink a war. Yet deep down he knew the secret couldn't stay hidden forever. Headquarters was starting to ask questions about the sudden surge in victories. Inspection reports were beginning to show odd readings. The system he'd built in shadows was about to face the light. And when that light finally reached him, Frank Miller would have to answer for every life his stupid wire trick had saved. It began with an inspection report, routine, unremarkable, filed by a young engineer at Doba Dura who noticed inconsistent cable tensions in several P-38s. The readings didn't match the factory specs, yet every aircraft flew better than it should have. The report traveled up the chain of command, slow and bureaucratic, until it landed on a desk in Brisbane with a note attached. Possible unauthorized modifications. Investigation recommended. Within weeks, a Lockheed engineering team arrived in New Guinea. They carried clipboards, micrometers, and the quiet authority of men who believed numbers told the whole story. To the mechanics, they might as well have been tax collectors. They began dismantling planes, measuring cables, tracing every control surface. It didn't take long to find it. The sliver of piano wire bent into a Z, small enough to escape notice, clever enough to change everything. The engineers exchanged glances. "Who did this?" one of them asked. No one spoke. In war, silence was sometimes the only form of protection. Eventually, word reached Captain Dalton, and from him, the truth reached Miller. That night, he waited outside the hangar, watching the engineers under the floodlights as they examined Hayes's aircraft like archaeologists unearthing a secret. Dalton stood beside him and said quietly, "They'll figure it out sooner or later." Miller nodded. "I know." He didn't run. He didn't deny it. When the questioning began the next morning, he answered plainly. Why he'd done it, how he'd done it, what it had changed. The engineers listened, took notes, and said nothing. There was no reprimand, no medal, just a silence that felt heavier than either. They collected samples, drafted a report, and left. 2 months later, Lockheed rolled out the new P-38J model. Buried in the technical summary was a single line. Improved control response through revised tensioning system. No mention of piano wire, no mention of Miller. By then, the war had moved north toward the Philippines, and men were too busy surviving to worry about footnotes. But the difference was undeniable. The Lightning was no longer feared for its sluggishness. It was respected for its precision. The pilots flew with confidence again, the kind that comes from trust in the machine beneath them. For Miller, there was no ceremony, no handshake. When his discharge papers arrived in 1946, he packed his tools, left the base, and returned to California. He opened a small garage on a quiet street in Long Beach, fixing cars for fishermen and teachers, never mentioning the war. The sign above the door read simply, Miller's Auto Service. To anyone passing by, he was just another mechanic. Years passed. Engines changed from pistons to turbines, from gasoline to jet fuel. The world moved on. But in the back office of that little garage hung a single photograph, a black and white image of a P-38 Lightning on a runway, two men standing beside it. One of them was Hayes, young and smiling, flight helmet tucked under his arm. The other, a step behind, was Miller, squinting against the sun, grease on his hands even then. Every year on the anniversary of that morning in New Guinea, Hayes would call. Sometimes they'd talk about the war, sometimes about baseball, sometimes about nothing at all. The call always ended the same way, with a pause, then Hayes saying, "You saved my life, Frank." Miller's answer never changed. "You did the flying, Jack. I just tightened a wire." Decades later, in 1991, a military historian researching field modifications stumbled upon a set of maintenance logs from the 475th Fighter Group. Scrawled in the margin of one report was a note in faded pencil. "Cable adjusted was found passant piano wire tensioner. Adds approx. 0.4 pulls." Intrigued, the historian began tracing the record, eventually finding Miller's name among the signatures. He tracked him down to that same garage in Long Beach, now run by Miller's son. Frank was 74, still working part-time, slower but steady. When asked about the modification, he shrugged. "Wasn't anything special," he said, "just something that needed doing." The historian later estimated that the adjustment, once adopted widely, may have saved 80 to 100 American pilots, men who went on to fly hundreds more missions and, in many cases, come home. But Miller didn't count numbers, he remembered faces: Chen, Morrison, Parker, Hayes, and the sound of the cables he'd once plucked in the dark. He said the sound still haunted him, not as guilt, but as memory. "Every mechanic hears that tone," he told the historian. "You know when something's not right, and if you don't fix it, someone dies." He paused, looked down at his hands, and smiled faintly. "Guess I just didn't want to hear that sound anymore." When Frank Miller passed away in 2006, his obituary mentioned his wartime service but not the invention that had changed how the P-38 flew. The obituary was short, almost plain. Beloved father, veteran, mechanic. But somewhere in a museum archive, a historian had written his own addendum. The piano wire tensioner, developed unofficially by Sergeant Frank Miller in 1943, remains one of the most effective field improvisations of World War II. At the funeral, Hayes, long retired and walking with a cane, placed a folded photo of a P-38 inside the casket. On the back of it, he'd written a single line: "To the man who made her fly." The church was small, the ceremony simple. Outside, as the wind swept through the coastal air, a faint metallic sound echoed from a nearby flagpole. The snap of a halyard against steel, ringing with the same tone that once haunted a mechanic in New Guinea. It was perhaps the final note of a story no manual had ever written. History remembered the aces. It forgot the man who made them possible. But somewhere between those pages of silence and victory lies the truth, that wars are not only won by those who fly, but by those who fix. And in the end, one stupid piece of wire proved that genius often hides in grease-stained hands, guided not by glory or command, but by the simple human desire to save another man's life.